Hello, and welcome to Real Cheating Story. My name is George Hewitt, and this is my story. I'm currently living in a studio apartment, but it wasn't always that way. A year ago, I had a 4-bedroom house, 2 cars, a mortgage, and a wife who loved me. My wife, Pat, and I had been married for 4 years and were planning to start a family when we managed to save a bit more money so she could quit her job and stay home with the baby. All of that changed when my younger brother, Louis, came to live with us. He had just gotten laid off and lived across the country from the rest of the family, feeling quite lonely. He thought this was a perfect time to come home and start anew. Louis didn't have much money, having only been working a few years and always being a little loose with his finances. Not wanting to move back in with our parents, he asked if he could stay with Pat and me until he found a job and an apartment. I asked Pat about it, and she was enthusiastic about having Louis live with us. She had always liked him and thought he was funny, and since we had the extra bedrooms, it was no problem. I appreciated her understanding, and the deal was made. A month later, Louis moved in. He was very grateful for our hospitality and promised not to disrupt our lives too much. The routine around the house changed a bit, but for the most part, it was for the better. Louis helped around the house and in the yard when he wasn't job hunting, making things easier for Pat and me. He even cooked occasionally, which Pat really appreciated. We spent our evenings watching TV, movies, or playing games, and it was nice to have my brother home again. We would go to our parents' house for cookouts, where Louis was the center of attention because he had been gone so long. My mother especially doted on him. After all, he was the baby of the family. Things went along well, but the job market was tough in our area, and Louis was having little luck finding anything. He felt the need to contribute more, as it seemed his stay with us would be longer than he had first hoped. He volunteered to take over all the outside chores and even helped with housework, which was helpful for me as I was involved with a project that was taking up more of my time than I liked. One night, I was sitting with my brother in the living room watching TV while Pat was out with some friends. It was just the two of us. "Louis, how's the job hunting going?" I asked, realizing it had been a while since we had talked. "I've got a lot of resumes out that I need to follow up on in a few days, but so far, no luck," Louis sighed, taking a sip of his soda. "I hear you, bro. The job market is tough right now, but you've got a good track record and a positive attitude. I'm sure you'll get that interview soon," I reassured him. I took a sip of my soda as well. "Any luck on the dating front?" Louis looked at me incredulously. "What dating front? I'm working when I'm not on interviews or at the library, and at night. I'm home with you and Pat. The only action I'm getting is from Mary Palm and her 5 sisters," he chuckled sadly. "You don't have to hang out here every night, you know? You should get out and meet people. Networking could help you in more ways than one." "Maybe I will. I'll have to look into groups in my field. Who knows, maybe I'll meet someone interesting too," he replied. Having my brother around did cut into our personal time together, but not too badly. We were never a couple to be spontaneous everywhere in the house, but we had enjoyed our time together and had found ways to maintain intimacy, especially on weekends. However, after Louis had been with us for 6 months, our frequency of intimacy had noticeably declined. Between the extra work I had been doing and the decrease in our personal time, I felt frustrated. So, I decided to make a change and booked a reservation at a bed and breakfast we had visited about a year ago for the upcoming weekend. I wanted it to be a surprise romantic getaway, but things didn't go as planned. "You did what?" Pat asked, incredulous. "I made reservations for Friday and Saturday night at our favorite bed and breakfast. We've been neglecting ourselves too long. We need a weekend away to recharge our batteries," I said enthusiastically. "Well, I wish you'd checked with me first because I can't go this weekend," Pat said heatedly. "If you'd listen when I talk, you'd know that I'm already committed to helping your mother with her yard sale all weekend. I'll call my mother and explain the situation. She'll understand," I said, trying to calm her down. "No, she won't. This is the neighborhood sale, and she's been planning this for months. She asked Louis to help too, so there's no way I can get out of it." "You take the cake, George," she replied with frustration before getting up and leaving the room, leaving me stunned. I quickly called and canceled the reservation. Luckily, it was early enough that I wouldn't incur any charges. After this little argument, our intimacy really dwindled. It seemed like I could do nothing right. If I wasn't working too much, I wasn't helping around the house and letting poor Lewis do all the work. I was baffled. Why was Pat acting this way? She knew I was focused on a big project at work that required a lot of overtime. And she also knew Lewis had volunteered to help out as a way of contributing while staying with us. I didn't like her attitude, so I confronted her. "What's your problem, Pat? You know I don't want to be working these kinds of hours. Lewis volunteered to help because we're not charging him rent. What's really bothering you?" "I don't have a problem, George. It's clear what's important to you, and it isn't me. We both have to work to pay for this house. Are you telling me you'd rather I quit my job?" She shot back. "No, I just want you to stop working so much. We never get to go anywhere anymore." "Well, whose fault is that? You're the one who couldn't disappoint my mother when I had planned a romantic weekend." I was frustrated now, and the tension escalated. "At least I helped your mother. You didn't do anything that weekend but hang around or play golf. Lewis did more to help than you did." Lewis, that's all I hear lately. If he's so great, why don't you move into his room and leave me alone? I'm sure he'd be more than happy to support this house." "Oh, wait, he doesn't have a job," I retorted, feeling anger boil inside me. I grabbed my jacket and stormed out. "I'm going out," I declared, slamming the door behind me. I drove to a local sports bar, nursing a beer while half-heartedly watching a basketball game. As I sat there, replaying the argument in my mind, I reflected on how we had both said things we might regret. I couldn't help but wonder why she was being so defensive and supportive of Lewis. For a moment, a troubling thought crossed my mind. Was she having an affair with him? I quickly dismissed the idea. I loved my brother, and he would never betray me like that. I didn't think Pat would either, but her attitude and the lack of intimacy lately made me uneasy. I knew I was frustrated, and I could only assume she was too. I contemplated whether she was feeling so discontent that she might seek solace elsewhere. But I had no real evidence to suspect anything was wrong, and I certainly wasn't going to hire someone to follow her based on mere suspicion. I did have a small voice-activated tape recorder that I could hide somewhere discreetly. I decided to start in the bedroom. If I didn't pick up anything after a week, I'd move it around the house. With a plan in mind, I finished my beer and headed home. I walked into the house quietly, hoping not to disturb anyone if they were asleep. The bedroom door wasn't locked, so I crept in as silently as possible, undressed, and slid into bed, turning away from Pat as I settled in for the night. Just as I began to drift off, I felt her hand on my shoulder. "George," she whispered. "Yes?" I responded cautiously. "I'm sorry, honey. I've been a real pain to you, and I don't know why you put up with me," she said softly, stroking my shoulder and back. "I love you, Pat. That's why. I'm sorry too. I've been working too hard and may have neglected you," I replied as I turned to face her. As soon as I turned over, she came into my arms, and we embraced tenderly. After a passionate moment together, we laid beside each other. "Wow, Pat, that was the best we've had in a long time," I said, kissing her gently. "Maybe we should argue more often," I teased. "No way. I hate fighting with you, George." "I'm really sorry, baby. Can you forgive me?" "Of course, honey. I hate fighting with you too." I kissed her on the nose again and flopped onto my back, pulling her into my arms. She laid her head on my chest, and we enjoyed the quiet moments together. I kissed her head and was surprised to find that she had already fallen asleep. I closed my eyes, allowing sleep to take me as well. The next morning, I felt foolish for having doubted Pat. We had just fallen into a rut, both frustrated and taking it out on each other. I promised myself not to be a jerk again. I turned over to watch her sleeping. She was beautiful, shoulder-length sandy blonde hair, green eyes, and a pleasing, curvy figure. "Hi, baby," Pat said with a smile as she opened her eyes. "Hello, sexy," I said, leaning in to kiss her deeply. "I love you so much." She smiled and caressed my cheek. "I love you too, George." Glancing at the clock, she threw back the covers. "I'm going to shower. Want to join me?" "Yeah, I'm right behind you." As I walked into the bathroom, I noticed a mark on her hip. It looked like a bruise but had an unusual shape. "Honey, what happened on your hip? It looks like you bruised it." Pat looked behind her but couldn't see what I was talking about. She stepped over to the mirror and saw the mark I mentioned. She blushed and seemed hesitant to answer. "Oh, I remember now," she said nervously. "I slipped in the tub yesterday and bumped against the soap dish. I didn't think I hit it that hard, but I guess I did." Soon, we started the shower, and it turned into an intimate moment. Afterwards, as we dried off, Pat hugged me tightly. "I'm so glad you liked it, George. I've been feeling a bit frisky lately. I read some articles about intimacy, and they really got me thinking. I hope you don't mind the new me." "Of course not, honey. Who would argue with a sexy wife who wants to please her husband?" I chuckled, giving her a playful smack on the hip as I headed to the bedroom. "Hey, watch that," she said with a smile. "You better get dressed, or we'll be late for work." "Yes, George, but just wait until tonight." Pat was true to her word that evening and many nights after. It felt like our intimate life had been renewed, but with a new energy. Where before our moments together had been gentle and slow, now they were more passionate and experimental. I enjoyed this new side of my wife immensely, but it also made me curious about the change. "Pat," I said after one particularly energetic session, "I hope you don't think I'm complaining, but where did this new enthusiasm come from? You never used to be this open." She looked at me, trying to gauge my sincerity. "I suppose I've been talking with a new friend at work," she admitted carefully. "She's very open about everything. Once we became friends, she started sharing stories about her life, and some of the things she mentioned made me blush but also intrigued me. I found a magazine that talked about pleasing your partner, and it reinforced a lot of what we discussed. I realized that I might have been a bit too reserved and was missing out on the fun we could have. Plus, you've been working a lot, and our intimacy had suffered. After our argument, I decided I wanted to be more open and adventurous. I'm really happy you've chosen to explore this new side of yourself in our relationship," I replied. "I love our intimacy and couldn't ask for a better partner." I kissed her deeply and rolled on top of her, enjoying the closeness we had once more. After Lewis had been living with us for about 9 months, he got a new job and moved out. I felt a mix of emotions. I was glad to have our home life back to normal without my brother around, but I also felt sorry to see him go since it meant I had to take over the yard work. He still stopped by for dinner once or twice a week, as Pat worried about him not eating right living alone. My project at work finally concluded, allowing my hours to return to normal, which I was grateful for. Pat always got home before me and would have dinner cooking when I walked in. On the days Lewis was over, he'd usually be at the house before me, hanging around for a couple of hours before going home. One night, I arrived home a few minutes earlier than usual. As I walked in, I heard what I thought was a groan. "Pat," I called out. "Are you okay, honey?" Pat hurried out of the kitchen, looking red-faced. "Oh, George, you're home early." "I'm fine. I just touched a hot pan," she said as she kissed me. I looked at her hand but didn't see any signs of a burn. "Looks like you didn't burn yourself too badly. Thank goodness. You need to be more careful." "I will, honey. Come and sit down. Dinner is almost ready." As we walked into the kitchen, I noticed Lewis sitting at the table. He had an odd look on his face for a moment, but it vanished before I could be sure. We ate as usual, then watched a video Lewis had brought. When it was time for him to leave, he collected his things, and Pat stopped him, saying she was sending some leftovers home with him. I told him good night and headed upstairs. I had time to get undressed and had been in bed for a few minutes when Pat finally came upstairs. "What took you so long?" I asked. "Just getting Lewis some leftovers. I sent a lot home with him," she said as she made her way to the bathroom. She did her usual routine in there, then emerged wearing her long nightgown. Climbing into bed, she gave me a quick kiss. "Good night, George." I was feeling affectionate this evening, so I leaned over and started kissing her. Pat turned into my arms and said, "Sorry, honey, I'm kind of tired. Can we do it tomorrow?" I nodded, feeling a bit disappointed. It took me quite a while to realize a pattern in our intimacy. At first, I thought it was just the unpredictability of our days, but I should have noticed the underlying conditions that remained constant. Over the next few months, I started to observe that on nights when my brother visited, our moments together shifted significantly. If we engaged at all, it was typically just oral intimacy. Pat always had some reason for why we couldn't be intimate, but she was more than willing to show her affection in other ways, so I didn't think too much about it initially. The turning point came when I noticed the long nightgown she often wore. Every time I saw Pat walk out of the bathroom in that gown, I couldn't help but associate it with a lack of intimacy. It dawned on me that whenever she wore it, our connection seemed to fade. Pat had received that nightgown as a Christmas gift from her mother. While she had thanked her graciously, it was clear that she didn't care for it and wore it infrequently. However, I realized she had started wearing it more often in recent months. This observation made me contemplate the correlation between the nightgown and our intimacy. Determined to test my theory, I decided to suggest something different. "Hey, baby, why don't you put on something nice?" I asked playfully. "Not tonight, baby. I'm really tired. Work was hectic, and all I want to do is sleep," Pat replied with a yawn. Sleep came slowly to me as I spent the next hour reflecting on the past weeks and months, trying to pinpoint when our intimacy had changed. It felt like it had been over 6 months since things shifted, but I still hadn't figured out why. I resolved to pay closer attention to the events in the future to understand the cause. I wasn't an investigator or detective, so it took me another month to notice a pattern. There were many things that happened on the nights Pat wore her nightgown, but one detail stood out. On those nights, our intimacy was limited. My brother had been over for dinner, but making a connection between his visits and our changing relationship was challenging. Lewis had been dropping by regularly since moving out, but rarely on the same night, usually only once a week. It felt like the most incredible coincidence, or perhaps there was a genuine connection between these events. One evening, while I was upstairs in my study, the phone rang. I picked it up at almost the same time as Pat. "Hello?" I heard her voice say, "Hi, can you talk?" I overheard her mention that I was working upstairs and should be occupied for a while. "Good. I want you to go down to the laundry room and close the door," she instructed playfully. I pressed the phone to my ear, intrigued, trying to keep my breathing steady. Soon, I heard her voice again. "I'm here. What are you wearing?" She replied, "A blouse, a bra, a skirt, and shoes." "Very good. Thank you. I wish you were here. I need to feel your hands on me," she said softly. I realized that Pat was engaged in a conversation that suggested more than just friendly banter. I was surprised to learn about her exchanges with LS, who was speaking to her in a way that hinted at a deeper connection. After they finished talking, Pat thanked him, and I sensed a thrill in her voice. She mentioned looking forward to seeing him the next day. They were clearly enjoying a secret that I was unaware of. After hanging up, I decided I would come up with a plan to catch them the following day at work. I began strategizing, thinking of a simple yet effective way to reveal what was happening. When I arrived home that night, Lewis was already there, casually reading the paper. I smiled at him, but my mind was elsewhere. I walked into the kitchen and gave Pat a quick kiss. "Hey, honey," she said cheerfully. "Why don't you get cleaned up? Dinner will be ready in a few minutes." "Oh, I almost forgot. I'll be working late tomorrow night, probably until about 11 o'clock, I said as I prepared to leave the kitchen. My boss told me we had to rework some of the figures for our proposal, and it had to be done by tomorrow. The first part of the plan was in motion. "Oh, George, not again," Pat cried. "Don't worry, I already told him not to make a habit of it," he assured me. He understood, and if this wasn't an emergency, he wouldn't have asked. I said this as I walked back and hugged her. "I'm sure we can deal with this one time, can't we?" Pat looked into my eyes and nodded her head. "Yeah, I suppose." She pulled out of my arms and returned to her cooking. "Go wash up now. I'm going to put the food on the table." "Yes, ma'am," I said as I hurried to the bathroom. During supper, I mentioned having to work late tomorrow to Lewis. I carefully watched his reaction, but I had to give him credit. There was no outward sign that this was good news. I wanted to make sure, so I put the second part of the plan into play. "Lewis, I'd like to ask you a favor," I said, putting down my fork. "What's that, bro?" Lewis asked. "I was wondering if you don't have anything going on tomorrow. Maybe you could come over and keep Pat company while I'm at work?" Lewis made a face as if he were thinking. "I don't have anything special going on tomorrow." "Sure, I'd love to do it," he said with a smile. I clapped him on the shoulder and smiled back. "Thanks, I really appreciate it." Our evening went along as usual. We finished supper, loaded the dishwasher, and then played cards for a couple of hours. Lewis left around 10, and after watching the news, Pat and I headed upstairs to bed. The next morning, I called into work after I pulled out of the driveway, telling my boss I'd be in late because I was having car trouble. I had some things I needed to do that morning to be ready for the big show that evening. I had already packed my digital camera in my briefcase, so my next stop was the hardware store. I picked up a small package of clothesline and a roll of duct tape, along with a few other items so the clerk wouldn't think I was up to anything suspicious. My next step was the bank, where I took half of our savings and opened a new account in my name only. Next, I called the credit card company, telling them I'd lost my wallet and needed to cancel my card. I requested a new card in my name only and to cancel the joint account. We had only been in our house for a few years and didn't have much equity beyond our down payment, so we would have to sell the house. I planned to split the proceeds 50-50 with her. After all, I did love her once. I wasn't in any hurry to get a lawyer because I knew that after tonight, I'd have enough evidence for an uncontested divorce. My hope was to convince her to draw up a settlement ourselves and then only hire a lawyer to file the papers. I went into work at noon and surprisingly got a lot done. I left at my usual time and hit a restaurant near work for supper. I wanted it to be dark when I got home, so I hung out at the mall for a while. As the sun was setting, I headed out. As I neared my house, I saw that the only lights on were those upstairs in our bedroom. It looked like they had taken the bait. I pulled into my driveway, shutting off the engine and coasting in so I wouldn't draw attention. I closed the door partway and then pushed it closed with my hip. I had my bag containing the camera, rope, and duct tape in a cloth bag to avoid making any noise. I opened the door carefully and slipped inside, taking off my shoes as I started climbing the stairs. Our bedroom was not in direct line of sight with the stairs, so no one saw me, but I climbed slowly, keeping my ears peeled for any sign of them. As I reached the top of the stairs, I could hear voices coming from the master bedroom. I crept silently to the door and paused, overhearing a conversation. It was good of old George to invite me over tonight to keep you company, wasn't it? LS said happily. Yes, master, it was a real surprise, but I'm not complaining. I can't get enough of you, Pat responded. I miss serving you. If you miss me so much, why don't you leave George? LS asked. I'd love to be with you always, but I love George too much. I don't think I could handle our relationship 24/7. As much as I enjoy being with you, I couldn't give up my life with George. How can you love George and still give yourself to me? LS asked curiously. It's because you opened my eyes to this part of me that I want to explore further. I couldn't do this with George. He'd think I was strange. But you made me aware of this side of me. George hasn't complained about my newfound freedom, but I don't think he'd understand my desire for something different. Does that answer your question? Yeah, I guess it does. We do things for each other that no one else will do. I want this to continue for as long as possible. Do you think George suspects anything? I was eager to hear the response. God, I don't think so. I hope not. He divorced me in a heartbeat and probably left you in a difficult situation. She paused, then continued, No, George doesn't suspect. He was sleeping like a baby last night. Good. How about we go shower? I love spending time with you in the bathtub, Lewis said. Yes, master, Pat giggled. I heard the rustling of the bedclothes, and then the light turned on in the bathroom. I snuck into the bedroom and got my camera ready. With the light coming from the bathroom, I was able to stand slightly off to one side and still see everything very clearly. I started taking a few pictures as they got the shower started. Soon, they began to get cozy. It was time to let my loving brother know exactly what I thought about it. I snuck into the bathroom, but he must have sensed I was there. He started to turn just as my fist connected with the side of his head. He dropped like he'd been poleaxed, hitting his head on the tile floor as he landed. Pat, unaware of what had happened, groaned out her frustration. What happened, master? I leaned forward and grasped her hair, pulling her back until our gazes locked. Your master is receiving his due, I said, before guiding her head downwards, and she tumbled into the tub. She hurriedly moved away from me, her voice rising in a panic as she cried out for silence. I raised my voice, urging her to calm down, but she recoiled from me, trembling in the tub. I retrieved the bag where I had hastily set it down and pulled out 2 lengths of rope. I used one strap to bind Lewis's hands behind his back and the other to secure his feet. I retrieved the duct tape and applied a piece over his mouth, careful not to obstruct his nose. My intent was to keep him silent, not to harm him. I bent down and lifted his form over my shoulder, then picked up my bag and tucked it into my pocket. I turned to face my soon-to-be ex-wife and said, "I have to show you how your master seeks your attention." I took them to the bedroom and confronted my soon-to-be ex-brother. "Say my name. Call me your master." I continued to assert my dominance, making it clear who was in control. I looked at Pat and said, "You wanted a dominating man. Look at what you chose. This situation disgusts me. Pat, get dressed and pack your things. Once I've dealt with him, he'll be back for you." I started to walk out but turned back, having one more thing to say. "By the way, I hate piercings on women." I walked out of the bathroom, down the stairs and out to my car, my wife's wailing ringing in my ears. I popped the trunk and tossed Lewis inside. He groaned but seemed to be out. The ride to my parents' house was quick but rough. I made sure to hit every bump and pothole along the way. I backed into the driveway nearest the gate leading to the backyard. My parents weren't home. It was their night out at the VFW, which I had anticipated as part of my plan. I opened the trunk, and as the light came on, I met Lewis' frightened gaze. "Listen up," I said, leaning in. "You need to stay away from me. If you see me coming, turn the other way." I made sure he understood the seriousness of my words. "If you don't want any trouble, you should leave town and cut ties with Pat. I won't be looking for you, but just know I'll find out if you do." I pulled out the note I had prepared, attaching it to Lewis' shirt. It explained to my parents why he was in this predicament, signed by me. I wanted them to know what had happened. "I'm leaving now, but don't worry. Mom and Dad will be home soon. They'll find you." As I headed home, I debated whether to say more, but I decided against it. When I arrived, I found Pat sitting in the living room, her bags by the door. I grabbed the 2 suitcases and said, "Let's go. We've got a long drive ahead." Pat ran by me, her eyes wide with fear, as she hurried to the car after putting her bags in the trunk. I climbed in and took off without a word. "Where are we going?" Pat asked nervously. "Your parents' house." "No, not there," she cried. "Shut up," I replied tersely, not wanting to hear her objections. Pat cowered against the door, trying to put as much distance between us as possible. The drive was quiet except for her sniffles and occasional cries. I was fuming the whole time, and her crying was doing nothing to calm me down. "Would you stop crying? It's getting on my nerves, and you really don't want to irritate me more than I already am." She either stopped or cried silently, for which I was grateful. 15 minutes later, I pulled into her parents' driveway. I turned in my seat and glared at my soon-to-be ex-wife. "Let's go. Time to wake good old Mom and Dad." I grabbed the suitcases, dumped them on the porch, and leaned on the doorbell. It didn't take long for the door to swing open, revealing her father, with her mother close behind. Both were in their pajamas. "George, what the hell are you doing? Why are you ringing the doorbell at this time of night?" he asked angrily. "Ask her. She knows the reason we're here." I pointed my thumb over my shoulder at Pat. "What is this all about?" her father asked, confused. Pat's head hung low, refusing to meet her father's eyes. I was getting impatient. "You'd better tell him right now, or I will. And believe me, I'll tell him everything." That got her attention, and she hurried to speak before I could continue. "I did something bad, Daddy. I need a place to stay, please," she begged. Since she wasn't forthcoming, I cut in. "Your daughter needed a man who could be assertive, and since her husband wasn't doing that, she found someone else. Today, I caught her with that man, who happened to be my own brother. I really wanted to teach her a lesson, but I won't spend time in jail for it. Just keep her here until she figures things out." Before her dad could ask anything more, I was already halfway down the walk. "Good night, folks," I called over my shoulder as I climbed into the car and drove off. By the time I got back home, it was 2 a.m., and I was exhausted. I stripped off my clothes and collapsed on the bed in the spare room. Tomorrow, I had a lot to do. First among them was to throw out the bed in the master bedroom. For now, all I needed was sleep. I slept fitfully, plagued by dreams of Lewis and Pat together, causing me to wake up in cold sweats. Finally, around 7 o'clock, I gave up and went downstairs to make some coffee. The coffee helped, as did some toast, but that was all I could keep down. I chuckled sadly, thinking I needed to lose some weight, and it looked like I was going to start doing that now. I sat drinking coffee until the pot was empty, then headed upstairs to shower, clean up, and shave. I was getting ready to get rid of the bedroom furniture when the phone rang. "George, what have you done?" "George, Mom, what are you talking about? Why did you do that to your brother?" "I want an answer now." I was annoyed that my ex-brother hadn't told my parents the reason for my actions. "I'll be right over, Mom." I hung up before she could reply. The trip to my parents' house took less time than it should have, as I broke nearly every traffic law along the way. I was out of the car and in the house in seconds. "Where is he? Where is that guy?" I hollered. "George," my mother yelled. "Stop that yelling. I'm not deaf. Who are you looking for?" "That no-good ex-brother of mine. Where is he?" "He's still at the hospital with your father." "Damn, I wanted to confront him." "Don't you think you've done enough already?" she asked pointedly. "Why did you do it, George? Answer me." "I haven't done nearly enough to him, not yet. I gave him a chance to come clean last night, and it's obvious he avoided telling you what he's done. Now it's my turn to make him tell you. You will not touch him, George. I will not have you terrorizing him. If you have something to say, you'd better say it, or you can leave." "Want to know why I did it? Okay, I'll tell you. I caught Lewis and Pat in my bed last night, and it wasn't the first time. I was shaking with anger as I spoke. He's trying to make me out to be the bad guy. That's impossible. He loves you, and he certainly loves Pat." The shocked look on my mother's face told me she still didn't believe me, and I've got the pictures to prove it. "Pictures?" she asked, confused. "Yes, Mom, I have pictures and video." I knew something wasn't right, and then I overheard a conversation between the two of them. I set them up and caught them in the act. I took plenty of pictures and some video to have the evidence I need when I divorced that woman I'm married to. I told Lewis I never wanted to see or speak to him again, and I expected him to tell the truth. Obviously, he didn't, so I had to. "I'm sorry, Mom, but it's the truth." My anger started to fade as my shoulders slumped. "It can't be," she said, shocked. "Your brother? Why would he do that?" "I don't know, Mom. All I know is that he did. I let him stay in my home, and this is how he repays me. I don't know how long they've been together, but it's been at least 6 months, probably more. I trusted him, Mom. I trusted him." "Oh, George, I'm so sorry, son." She hugged me, and I lost it. I cried on her shoulder for everything I'd lost. My wife, my marriage, and my brother. We stayed that way for several minutes, her rubbing my back and whispering her love for me. She directed me to the kitchen, where she got me a cup of coffee. I sipped my drink silently, staring into the cup. She waited patiently for me to calm down, patting my hand and sighing heavily, knowing she could do nothing to ease my pain. Finally, once the cup was empty, I felt calm enough to continue. "Sorry about that, Mom," I said, embarrassed. "Don't be silly, George. You needed to get that out. Obviously, I'm just sorry you had to go through that." She paused, uncertain whether to ask what was on her mind. "So, what are you going to do? What about you and Pat?" "I took Pat to her parents' place last night. I'm going to divorce her," I said seriously. "Divorce? Are you sure, George?" "Pat loves you," she said emphatically. "Yeah, right. Pat loves me, all right. She loves me so much that she's with my brother." "George, I will not have you using that kind of language, no matter how angry you are." "I'm sorry, Mom. It's just that every time I think about last night, I get so angry. I'll try not to swear." I was truly sorry. I had never used that kind of language in front of my parents. I can't abide what Pat has done. It's as simple as that. It was bad enough that she cheated on me, but to do it with a member of my family? That's unforgivable. "Speaking of your brother, what about him? He's family, George." "Not anymore. Not to me. My brother died last night. The brother I grew up with, the kid I protected from bullies, the kid who asked me to take him into my home, wouldn't do what he did to me. He proved to me that he's no longer the brother I knew. So he's dead to me. I never want to see or speak to him again." "George," she said, shocked. "I mean it, Mom. I told him last night, and I'm telling you now. If I see him again, I will confront him. The look on my face told her I was serious. But, George, he's family. Mom tried again. Not to me, he's not. Look, I understand he's your son, but so am I. I never want to see him again. I don't want to hear his name. If you can't do this for me, Mom, then you will have only one son. If he's here, I won't be. That's the bottom line. I rose from the table, kissed her on the cheek, and went home. When I got there, I cleaned out the bedroom. The bed was the first thing to go, but ultimately, I emptied the whole room. I called the Salvation Army and donated everything to them. Maybe someone would get some happiness out of it, as I certainly couldn't. I moved my things to the spare bedroom and put the remainder of Pat's belongings in garbage bags, storing them in the garage until she could come to get them. I went to the hardware store and bought new locks since I hadn't gotten Pat's keys last night. Having taken a week's vacation, being at work was not an issue, thank goodness, because I was pretty much useless for anything requiring mental sharpness. I called a buddy of mine who had gone through a divorce recently to get the name of his lawyer. He had done okay, or at least he didn't complain about his lawyer too much, so I thought I'd use the same one. I got the name and made an appointment for late that afternoon. I brought my pictures and video on a thumb drive, but also printed a few just in case. The lawyer told me that the evidence would probably make the divorce go easier since he was pretty sure Pat's lawyer wouldn't want that video shown in court. He said he'd have the papers drawn up the next day and have her served as soon as possible. The last detail was a deposit that drained my bank account, only pissing me off more. It felt unfair that I was paying for the fallout from my wife and brother's betrayal. By the time I returned from the lawyer's office, there were 10 messages on the machine. I figured some of them would be from Pat and the rest from people I didn't want to talk to anyway, so I ignored the flashing light but turned off the ringer on all the phones so I wouldn't be bothered. I opened some canned soup and settled down in front of the TV. I'm not a drinker, so I didn't get stinking drunk to forget. I tried to keep busy, but it was a losing cause. I watched a lot of TV, but I couldn't tell you one program that had been on since I had missed so much sleep the previous night. I didn't expect I'd get too much sleep that night either. I took a sleeping pill, the recommended dose, no more, and was blissfully asleep soon after lying down. But my dreams didn't allow for any rest. All I could dream about was Louis and Pat, laughing at me. I woke in a cold sweat a couple of times, but managed to get a few more hours in before I dragged myself to the shower to start another day. After 2 days of sulking around the house, I went back to work. I couldn't take just sitting around doing nothing but thinking. I found myself going over and over what I had done to make Pat and Louis treat me like this, and I got nowhere. I couldn't think of any reason that made sense. I had truly thought Pat would never cheat on me. No way. We were very happy, or so I thought. Why Louis did this was even more unfathomable. I had been his best friend since we were kids. I never thought he had any attraction to Pat beyond that of a beloved brother-in-law. What bothered me more than the betrayal was the fact that both the woman I loved and my own brother had let me down. That was something I couldn't forgive. I was confused by the nature of their betrayal. I suppose you never really know the complexities of your family. You don't discuss such things at the dinner table. Maybe Louis had seen something in Pat that suggested she'd be receptive to his advances. As much as I didn't want to know the details of their affair, I had seen and heard enough to last me a lifetime. Despite my curiosity, I wasn't ready to talk directly to Pat yet. She had left numerous messages on the machine, begging me to forgive her and expressing her regret, the usual things you hear from someone caught cheating. I called my mother and asked her to tell Pat that she could pick up the remainder of her clothes and things from the garage the coming Saturday, as I was planning to be away the whole day. Mom voiced her displeasure with me, but finally agreed to pass my message along. I left the house very early, at 6 a.m., to avoid any chance that Pat would be able to catch me at home. I returned well after midnight for the same reason, even driving past the house with the lights off to make sure no cars were in the driveway or garage. Thank God for wireless door openers. As I opened the back door, I noticed a note taped to the glass. Of course, it was from Pat. I had to give her credit for taking every opportunity to contact me. I tore the note off the glass, debating whether to read it or throw it in the garbage can. 3 months after that horrible night, I was finally calm enough to consider meeting with Pat. She had moved from her parents' home, as the commute to her job was too long, and had rented a studio apartment in the city, or so I'd heard from my mother. I understood why my mother kept in contact with Pat. She was the daughter my mother never had, and they had always gotten along very well. Mom was almost like a second mother to Pat. They were that close. I had to give my mother credit. She didn't nag me about Pat. Instead, she dropped subtle hints and bits of information, like that about her getting an apartment, into our conversations. I ignored them, not giving her the satisfaction of a reaction, and she continued talking as if nothing was amiss. It was an interesting game we played. I also appreciated that my parents respected my demand regarding Louis. No word of him was uttered in my presence while I was at their home, for which I was very grateful. They must have spread the word to our extended family as well, because I never heard any comments from them either. At least not when I was within earshot. One time, I did overhear my aunt asking my mother about Louis, but as soon as I made my presence known, both of them clammed up. I smiled and said thanks as I passed through, letting them continue their conversation in peace. So it was that during one of my visits, as I was getting ready to leave, I asked my mother for a favor. "Mom, I need a favor." "Of course, honey. What can I do for you?" "I need you to contact Pat for me." "Oh, George, I'm so happy." "Hold on, Mom. I'm not taking her back. I've decided that I need to hear her out before the divorce becomes final. That's all. Despite what she's done, she deserves a chance to tell me why she did it. Ask her to meet me at the TGI Fridays on Lake Cook Road at 5 o'clock on Saturday. If she can't make it, ask her to leave a message on the machine." "TGI Fridays? You can't have a private conversation there. It's too loud," she said incredulously. "It's also very public. I don't want her going into the details of her affair with a bunch of families around. I just want to know why, not how. If she can't meet me where I want to meet, then to hell with her." I was starting to get upset again, which wasn't a good sign. "Calm down, honey. You don't have to get upset. I'm sure Pat will talk to you anywhere you want. She's not going to brag, George. She's very embarrassed about what she did. She apologized to me for driving a wedge between my sons, and I've forgiven her. I hope you can find a way to forgive her, too. You can forgive her all you want. I don't care. It depends on what she has to say to me. If she can't give me a reason that I can accept, then how can I forgive her? Even if I do forgive her, it's not going to make a difference to our marriage. It died that night, horribly, when I heard and saw what happened. It's not going to be resurrected. I know you don't want to hear that, Mom, but I'm not going to sugarcoat this. And I don't want you getting Pat's hopes up either. This meeting is her chance to tell me why she cheated on me, nothing else." There was silence on her end. I knew it. "Mom, it's so easy to give a lecture when you're not the victim." "All right, George. When I talk to her, I'll tell her just what you said. I hope what she tells you will allow you to move on. I think you're doing the right thing. You two need to talk at least once before you end your marriage." She kissed my cheek as I hugged her goodbye. "Good night, Mom," I said as I closed the door behind me. Despite my efforts to remain calm, I was very nervous. This was the first time I'd be seeing my wife since that night. How was I going to react? I picked the place for more than the reason I told my mother. I hoped it would deter me from any irrational action that might end with me in jail. I didn't know if it would work, but I thought it would. I wasn't the kind of guy to make a scene in a restaurant, especially one with children around. I arrived at 4:45 and told the hostess that I'd need a table for two, non-smoking, but that the other party hadn't arrived yet. She told me she'd seat us as soon as my party arrived. I was waiting by the door when Pat walked in. She was dressed casually in a crisp cotton blouse, blue jeans, and sneakers. Her hair was pulled back from her face, and she wore very little makeup. She looked good, just as good as she always had. "Pat," I said. "George," she said with a shy smile. "Our table is ready," I said, motioning to the hostess. We were seated near the windows, away from other diners, but within earshot if we got loud. The hostess gave us our menus and left. "George," Pat started. "Please, let's eat first. I don't want to ruin my meal, and I have a feeling this conversation isn't going to be conducive to good digestion." "Sorry, Pat," I said, chastised. We perused the menu, and by the time we'd made our decisions, the server arrived. We placed our orders and waited mostly in silence. For some reason, we couldn't find much to talk about that didn't sound strained, so we didn't say much at all. The meal arrived quickly and was eaten silently as well. I actually felt sad. Before this whole mess, we had been able to talk about anything. Pat was a very intelligent conversationalist, and it was fun engaging with her. We didn't always agree, but we always had fun. I ordered coffee for both of us, but after it arrived, the silence continued. I suppose it was up to me to begin. Why did you cheat on my brother? I asked simply. Pat sighed deeply. She had known this moment was coming all evening, but it didn't make it any easier to start. I'm so sorry, George. I don't know what got into me. I know what, or who, got into you, I said, leaning close so she could hear me. I want to know why. Pat shrank back, tears in her eyes. I'm sorry, George. I'm so sorry, she cried softly. We've established that you're sorry, Pat. It's too late for that. There should have never been a situation where you had to feel sorry. It's way past time for apologies. I gazed into her eyes, wanting to see her response to my next statement. By the way, how long were you involved with my brother? You'd have thought I slapped her in the face. Her eyes widened, and she inhaled sharply, her mouth opening and closing a few times without any words coming out. It's not that hard a question, Pat. How long? She settled down, but the blush that rose up her neck told me I wouldn't like the answer. A year, she said hesitantly. My jaw dropped, and I was now the one speechless. A year? She had been involved with my brother for a year, and I had only guessed a few weeks before the end. What a fool I felt. I guess the old cliches are true. The husband is the last to know. I see, I said, trying not to react as violently as I wanted to. The restaurant had filled up more by now, which tempered my reaction. I know you want a reason why I cheated, but I really don't have a good one, George. It wasn't a decision I made one day. I didn't get up and tell myself that today I was going to cheat on my husband. Pat sipped her coffee, giving herself time to compose her thoughts. It was just innocent flirting at first. Louis always flirted with me, and you didn't seem to mind. That's when I thought it was innocent fun. I never contemplated that either of you would do what you did. I know, she wailed, glancing down at the table but continuing to talk. One day, he caught me up against the kitchen sink when I had my hands in the water. When he touched me, I screamed at him, but he just kept it up. He took what he wanted, and all of a sudden, it was like a switch had been thrown in my brain. I wanted what he was doing, and I had no control over my body. I didn't want to believe I could react that way, but I did. Even later, after he left for the day and I was alone, I craved more of what he'd done to me. No matter how angry I was at myself for what I had done, I wanted it. It was like I was addicted and needed my next fix. I kept going back for more despite my efforts to fight it. I don't know what else to say, George, except that I'm so very sorry. I had my answer, but it wasn't what I expected. It was worse than I ever thought. Her explanation told me for certain that our marriage was over. If she was as she described, addicted to that kind of treatment, there was no hope for us as a couple. I couldn't live with the fear that some other man would flip that switch in her brain again and put me through the hell I had been in since that night. Thank you, Pat. I know that had to be hard for you. I appreciate your honesty. I can't say I understand, but I can at least accept your explanation, I said quietly. Is there any hope for us, George? I do love you so very much, she begged. Are you kidding me? I guess you do. I can't see how you can do what you've done and still claim to love me. Even if I believed you loved me, I couldn't accept your actions. I may have stopped you from continuing your affair with Louis, but I can't live with the fear that some other man might come along someday and give you what I know I cannot. I'm sorry, Pat, but that's the way I feel. I understand, George. I had to try. I just had to, she cried, pulling a tissue from her purse to dry her eyes. Thank you for meeting with me, George. I never meant for any of this to happen. You have to believe that, but I know I brought this on myself. I'm ashamed that I was so weak that I let it destroy our marriage. I am too, Pat. I really am. I'm going to miss you, but we both know it's not going to work for us. I forgive you, Pat. I forgive you. I sniffled a bit, but smiled at her nonetheless. We parted ways, both knowing we wouldn't keep in touch. She wished me well, and we shared a quick kiss on the cheek before going our separate ways. About a year after that horrible night, the divorce was finalized. We sold the house and split the profits, agreeing on the settlement long before the hearing, which was merely a formality. The final decree was mailed to my new apartment a few weeks later. I had been very skittish about women since the divorce. I had a few dates, but nothing serious. I fell into a routine. I worked, went to the gym to relieve stress, and returned home day after day, month after month. It's not a bad life, but it's not what I had envisioned for myself 2 years ago. I suppose you're wondering if I ever forgave my brother. The answer is no. I saw him once at my parents' home, and my dad had to hold me back while he ran for his life out of the house. That confrontation happened twice. I did land a few punches the last time I saw him. I kept my word. I've stopped visiting my parents without notice because I didn't want to end up in jail. I knew I couldn't look at him without feeling the weight of his betrayal. It was easier for me to remember him as my little brother, the boy I loved as a kid, rather than the man I found in my home that night. Family ties remain strained, but no one is willing to discuss the subject with me. Did I forgive Pat? No. After the divorce and settling the assets, I made a choice. I shared all the pictures and videos of my brother and Pat with our relatives and friends. I even sent a video to my brother's office and my ex-wife's workplace. Now, all three of us are outcasts in our social circles. We aren't invited to family gatherings, my brother and my ex-wife for obvious reasons, and I because of an unspoken fear that I might stir up controversy. I know I shouldn't have acted that way, but there's an old saying, play stupid games, win stupid prizes. Dear listeners, please share your thoughts in the comments section below, and don't forget to like, share,